I didn't have anyone to spend Christmas with this year, no wife, no kids, and I hadn't spoken to my family in years. So I figured I'd make the best of it and rented a cabin deep in the Appalachians. I thought some solitude might do me good. No city noise, no people, just snow-covered woods and a fire. I got there Christmas Eve, just before sunset. The place was simple small living room, a wood stove, and a big window looking out onto the pines. It felt peaceful. I even caught myself smiling as I built a fire and settled in with a drink. The first few hours were uneventful. I cooked some dinner, stared into the fire, and tried to enjoy the quiet. Around 9 p.m., I stepped out onto the porch for a cigarette. The snow was falling steadily, muffling the world around me. It was almost too quiet. No wind, no animals, just this heavy silence. That's when I noticed it. Something moved between the trees, about 50 yards out. At first, I thought it was a deer, but it was too tall. It moved slowly, deliberately, weaving between the trunks like it was watching me. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My gut told me it wasn't right, but my brain fought back with reason. Maybe it was just a shadow, or a trick of the light. I crushed my cigarette and went back inside, bolting the door behind me. I tried to shake the unease, but it lingered. The cabin, which had felt cozy an hour ago, now felt stifling. The big window seemed too exposed, like something or someone could be watching. I didn't sleep. I sat there by the fire until dawn, poker in hand, heart racing at every creak or gust of wind. When daylight finally came, I worked up the nerve to look outside. The porch was empty, but the snow told a different story. Footprints led from the tree line to the porch. They weren't human. The toes were too long, the shape too strange, and they circled the cabin, stopping by the window where I'd been sleeping. I didn't wait to figure out what made them. I packed my bag, threw on my coat, and got out of there as fast as my car could handle the icy road. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But I'll tell you this, I won't ever spend Christmas alone in the woods again. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. I've lived alone in a remote mountain cabin for years, surrounded by dense forest and snow, and never once felt uneasy until last winter. It started after I returned from setting trap lines deep in the woods and noticed massive clawed tracks circling the cabin. They were larger than anything I'd ever seen and spaced strangely. Not like any bear or animal I could name, but I brushed it off as a predator passing through and locked the door as usual, pushing a heavy dresser in front of it, just in case. That night, as the wind howled, I was nearly asleep when I heard heavy, deliberate thumps outside, moving in a slow rhythm. At first, I thought it might be the old wood creaking in the cold, but then came a faint scratching, like claws dragging across the walls. The sound circled the cabin, methodical, stopping at the window nearest my bed. I didn't dare move, my heart pounding, and when 3 deliberate knocks echoed on the glass knock, 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 I grabbed the rifle beside my bed and sat frozen in place. The sound stopped, and I stayed awake until dawn, too terrified to even check outside. The next morning, I finally stepped out to investigate and found long scratches scored into the wood of the cabin walls. The tracks in the snow were back, circling the house in tight loops, but vanishing abruptly in the middle of the yard, as if whatever had made them had simply disappeared. I wanted to believe it was just an animal, but something about it felt wrong, unnatural. Still, I stayed. That night, I built the fire high, hoping it would keep anything away, and sat with my rifle in my lap. For hours, the forest was silent, and I began to convince myself it had all been in my head. Then, close to midnight, I heard it, a low, haunting whistle drifting through the trees. It didn't sound like the wind or any animal I knew. It was deliberate, almost human. I stood up, my pulse racing, and peered out the window. The yard was empty, the snow untouched, but the whistle came again, sharper this time, from the opposite side of the cabin. I turned to follow the sound, and in the shadows of the tree line, I saw it, a flicker of movement, something big, ducking out of sight. It wasn't an animal. It didn't move like one. It moved like it was watching me. The sound stopped, but I stayed awake all night, rifle in hand, every nerve on edge. By dawn, fresh tracks had appeared, circling the cabin again. This time, on the porch just outside my door, there was something else. A pile of sticks arranged into a crude, human-like shape. My chest tightened, and without hesitation I packed my things and left. I drove until the snow turned to pavement. not stopping until I reached the safety of town. I haven't been back to the cabin since. People here laughed it off, said it must have been wolves, a bear, or even my imagination, but I know better. Whatever was out there wasn't just an animal, and sometimes on quiet nights, when the wind whistles through the trees, I still hear that sound low, haunting and deliberate. I know it's still out there, waiting. Last winter break, I picked up work delivering food for DoorDash. It's the easiest way to make quick cash without interviews or training. College was out for the month, and I needed enough money to hold me over until spring semester. My dad let me borrow his old pickup truck, which was better suited for snowy roads than my beat-up little sedan. It was about 2 weeks before Christmas, and the snow had been falling steadily all day. Most people were hunkered down at home, which worked in my favor. I was getting constant orders, and the tips were generous. I'd been at it for hours when one last order popped up around 11 p.m. The pickup was from a nearby KFC, and the delivery address was about 20 minutes away. The payout was solid, so I accepted it. The map showed the house was tucked inside one of those older, wealthier neighborhoods across the county. The kind with sprawling yards, tall iron gates, and houses set far back from the road. I'd driven past the area before, but never delivered inside. The snow had really started to pile up by the time I reached the neighborhood. The streetlights glowed dimly through the thick flakes, and most houses were dark, their owners likely asleep. As I made my way through the winding streets, I couldn't help but notice how eerie it felt. Huge homes, spaced far apart, completely silent under the weight of snow. When I reached the delivery address, I realized the driveway hadn't been plowed at all. There was at least a foot of snow blocking the path, so I parked along the curb and started trudging up to the house with the bag of food clutched in my hand. Snow immediately began soaking into my shoes and jeans, and I muttered curses under my breath. The house was enormous, but completely dark, not a single light on. As I reached the front door, I noticed a piece of paper taped to it. In bold red letters at the top, it said, "Notice." Below there was text from the county about the property. But before I could read further, I heard a sound behind me, the crunch of boots in snow. I turned around and saw a man emerging from the side of the garage. He was wearing a dirty, oversized jacket, and his hair was buzzed short. His face was pale, and his eyes. Something about them felt hollow, sunken. "Just dropping off your order," I said, holding out the bag toward him. He didn't respond. He just walked up to me slowly, hand extended, until I placed the food in his grasp. But instead of turning back toward the house, he just stood there, staring at me. Seconds passed, and my stomach knotted tighter with each one. Why wasn't he going inside? Why had he even come from around the garage instead of the front door? "All right, have a good night, sir," I said, trying to sound casual. I stepped sideways into the snow, attempting to pass him. That's when he lunged. His hand swiped toward my arm, fingers outstretched, but I stumbled back just in time. His voice came low and sharp as he said, "Come with me." My heart slammed against my ribs as I turned and bolted down the driveway. The snow made every step sluggish, but adrenaline kept me moving. Behind me, I heard him shouting, "Stop running!" His boots crunched closer and closer in the snow. Somehow I reached the truck, yanked open the door, and slammed it shut just as he reached the tailgate. I shoved the keys into the ignition, reversed out of the snowbank with my tires spinning and screeching, and sped away from the house. In my rearview mirror, I saw him standing at the edge of the driveway, barely illuminated by the truck's taillights. He wasn't chasing anymore. He was just watching. I didn't stop driving until I reached a gas station a few miles away. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely dial 911. I told the dispatcher everything, every detail I could remember. The police called me back a few hours later with an update. The house wasn't occupied. It had been foreclosed months ago and was currently listed as vacant. Whatever the paper on the door said was probably related to that. But the man? They didn't know who he was or where he'd gone. Even now, months later, I can't pull up to a darkened house for a delivery without feeling that same cold dread crawl up my spine. I always catch myself scanning the shadows, half expecting to see that pale face and hollow eyes staring back at me from the dark. It gets lonely out here in the winter. It always has. But that's how I like it. The cabin I live in is a small, crooked structure my grandfather built years before I was born. It sits at the edge of a thick forest, miles away from the nearest town, where the snow falls so heavy it drowns out every sound except your own breathing. Out here, silence isn't peaceful, it's absolute. Hunting's my life, deer mostly. Keeps the freezer full, and the routine keeps me sane. Up before dawn, rifle slung over my shoulder, and a day spent moving slow through trees I know better than the back of my hand. I don't mind the isolation. Most days, it feels like I'm the only thing alive for miles. But last winter, that winter was different. It had snowed heavy the night before, so the ground was soft and pristine when I stepped outside at sunrise, boots sinking with every step. I was heading to my usual trail when I saw them prints leading up to my cabin. Large prints. Bear. Now, I've seen plenty of bear tracks in my time, but these were strange. The spacing was wrong, too close together, like whatever made them wasn't walking right. And they didn't trail off back into the woods. They just stopped. 10 feet from my porch. I stopped too, my breath fogging up in front of me as I scanned the trees. Nothing. Just the weight of the woods staring back at me, quiet as the grave. My hand tightened on the rifle. Black bears were common enough, but one coming this close to the cabin, in the dead of winter, it didn't sit right. I shook it off and set out. The day went slow, and I didn't see a damn thing. Not a rabbit, not a bird. Even the forest felt off too still. The air was heavy, like the trees were holding their breath. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something there. Watching. By mid-afternoon, I gave up and turned back for home. That's when I saw it, a deer, half hidden behind a cluster of pines. It was standing still, too still, its head turned toward me. I froze, raising my rifle, but something made me hesitate. Its body was thin, almost unnatural, its legs longer than they should have been. Its head tilted slightly to the side like it was, studying me. I lowered the gun. My chest felt tight. It let out a sound low and guttural, like a growl, but deer don't growl. I blinked, and before I could process what I'd just heard, it bolted, its movement jerky and awkward, vanishing into the trees. I stood there for a long time, rifle limp in my hands, before I finally forced myself to move. That night, I locked every door and window in the cabin. The tracks were still out there, I could feel it. I stoked the fire higher than usual and sat at the table, listening. I don't know what I was expecting. Maybe the sound of branches snapping or claws scraping against the walls. Nothing came. I don't remember falling asleep, but something woke me in the dark. A noise outside. Scraping. I sat up straight, my heart pounding. The fire was low, just flickering coals now, and the cabin felt impossibly cold. I strained my ears, listening. There it was again. A slow, dragging scrape against the front door. Just a bear, I whispered to myself, my voice barely audible. A bear looking for food. But I didn't believe it. I grabbed the rifle, my hands slick with sweat, and stood. The scraping stopped. Silence again, but this time it felt alive. I could hear something breathing slow, heavy breaths just on the other side of the wood. I took a step closer to the door, the floorboards creaking under my weight, and that's when I heard it. Deep, slow, human-like panting and grunting, sounding like an exhausted man on the other side. Broken up by a whisper, it sounded something like, "Let me in." I couldn't quite make it out. The blood drained from my face. I backed away from the door, rifle trembling in my grip. "Get out of here!" I shouted. But the voice came again, much louder this time, mimicking me. "Get out of here!" The scraping resumed. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair, and scrambled toward the bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I dropped to the floor, aiming the rifle at the doorway, and waited. The scraping stopped again, and then nothing. Minutes dragged into hours. I didn't move, barely breathed. My eyes locked on the door, half expecting it to burst open. But it didn't. The cabin was silent again, except for my heartbeat thudding in my ears. My rational mind said it was an animal and a junkie lost in the forest on some sort of drug. But I couldn't help but feel that it was something unnatural. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. Before Callie and I officially started dating, we spent a lot of time together. We both loved hiking, and her family owned a rustic cabin deep in the woods of northern Maine, near a quiet little ski resort. She invited me up there one weekend in February, our first proper trip together. The drive was long, about 6 hours, and the last hour was spent winding up narrow, snow-covered roads with thick pines pressing in from both sides. We passed a handful of driveways, most leading into shadowy woods, their tire tracks buried under fresh snow. Callie explained that most of these places belonged to out-of-state owners who only visited in the summer. When we finally reached the cabin, it was almost dark. The place was small and charming, with smoke curling from the chimney and a heavy blanket of snow softening every edge. Inside was warm and cozy, though it was clear the place was old, mismatched furniture, and no running water. Callie pointed out an outhouse tucked behind some trees for when nature called. That first night, we cooked pasta on the wood stove and watched a movie on her laptop. The only light came from the soft glow of the screen and the flickering fire. At some point, I stepped outside to use the outhouse. The snow was falling thick and fast, and the woods around me felt impossibly still. The next morning, I noticed something strange as I trudged back to the outhouse. Footprints in the snow. They were large, not animal prints, but wide boot marks. The trail led from the edge of the woods to the cabin, then circled around to the back. I called Callie outside and she frowned as she examined the prints. "Probably just some hunter or hiker," she said. But even as she said it, I could tell she didn't entirely believe it. We spent the day snowboarding at the resort. It was perfect. Clear skies, powdery snow, and hardly any other skiers. On our way back, we stopped at a diner and grabbed burgers and hot chocolate. By the time we pulled into the driveway, the sun had long disappeared, and the woods were swallowed by pitch-black night. Inside, we cranked up the heat, started a fire, and opened a couple of beers. Callie played music on her phone while we sprawled on the couch, warm and drowsy from the day's adventure. Eventually, I needed to use the outhouse again. I bundled up, grabbed a flashlight, and stepped into the freezing night. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the beam of my light, and everything was deathly quiet. As I sat in the outhouse, the faint sound of crunching snow reached my ears. Slow, deliberate steps. My heart froze. "Callie," I called out softly. No reply. The footsteps stopped. Then they resumed, moving away from the outhouse, back towards the cabin. I texted Callie, "Are you outside?" But there was no signal. After what felt like an eternity, I finished up and hurried back to the cabin. But as I approached, something felt wrong. The lights inside were out, and the music had stopped. I followed a fresh set of footprints in the snow to the front door, my breath sharp in the freezing air. Before I could knock, the door flew open, and Callie yanked me inside. She slammed the door, locked it, and whispered, her voice shaking. There was someone out there. They tried to open the door. I thought it was you, but when I saw their face in the window, she trailed off, eyes wide with fear. Callie showed me a hatch in the floor, her dad's hidden storage. Inside were a few hunting rifles. I grabbed one, loaded it, and sat on the couch with her in complete darkness, the cold creeping in around us. We waited. For what felt like hours, there was nothing. Just the wind against the walls and the faint patter of snow on the roof. Then, the sound came again. Footsteps, circling the cabin. I jumped up, flung the front door open, and fired 3 shots into the air. My voice was raw as I screamed into the night. "Get out of here!" The footsteps stopped. Silence returned, thick and suffocating. We didn't sleep that night. At dawn, we packed our things and left, following Callie's dad's advice to get out as soon as it was light. As we pulled away, I glanced back at the cabin. Snow had covered most of the footprints, but I could still see faint tracks leading into the woods, deeper and deeper, until they vanished into the trees. We never went back to that cabin. Callie's family put it up for sale later that year, and part of me hopes whoever owns it now never has to hear those slow, deliberate footsteps in the snow. It had been 3 weeks since Michael and I broke up, just as December was settling into its bitter cold. The breakup wasn't dramatic, just the kind of slow fizzling out that left me feeling empty. Christmas Eve only made it worse. My friends were busy with their own families, and the thought of spending another night alone in my tiny apartment was unbearable. After half a bottle of wine and a lot of second-guessing, I re-downloaded Tinder. The profiles were the usual mix guys holding fish, gym mirror selfies, weird bios about not looking for anything serious. But then I saw him, James. His profile picture was of him at an ice rink, smiling. dark hair falling into his eyes. His bio was charming in a simple way. New in town, looking for good food and better company. It felt refreshing compared to everything else, so I swiped right. Within minutes, we matched. He messaged me first something about how my photo looked cozy, which made me laugh. The conversation was easy, natural, and before I knew it, he asked if I'd like to grab dinner the next evening, Christmas Day. I hesitated. Meeting a stranger on Christmas felt odd, but I reminded myself that I had no other plans. What's the harm in dinner? The next day, we met at a little Italian place near the edge of town. He looked even better in person-tall, broad shoulders, with an easy smile that made me relax almost instantly. Over dinner, we talked about everything. The cities we'd lived in, our favorite Christmas memories, even the cringy Hallmark movies we both secretly loved. It felt like a movie itself. Two strangers finding each other on Christmas. Afterward, he suggested we head to an ice skating rink nearby. It had been years since I'd skated, but the idea sounded fun, and I didn't want the night to end. The rink was small and crowded with families and couples, the air cold enough to bite, but somehow comforting under the glow of twinkling Christmas lights. James was good at skating, gliding effortlessly while I clung to the edge, laughing at myself. After a while, he grabbed my hands and pulled me into the middle of the rink. I stumbled, nearly falling, but he caught me, his grip firm but gentle. "You're getting better," he said, his voice warm and teasing. "I'm terrible, and you know it." He laughed, and for a moment, it felt like the world outside didn't exist. After the rink, James invited me back to his place for a drink. I hesitated, but the night had been so perfect, and he seemed kind, so I said yes. His apartment was small but cozy, with mismatched furniture and a faint smell of pine, like he'd lit a Christmas candle earlier. We sat on the couch sipping wine and talking more. I only had one glass, not enough to make me drunk, but I felt off. It was subtle at first, a lightheadedness that I chalked up to the skating and the cold. But then my limbs started to feel heavy, my thoughts muddled. James was talking, but his words felt distant, like they were coming through water. "You okay?" he asked, his voice soft. I nodded, but even that felt like a struggle. My memory blurred after that. I remembered him helping me to my feet, saying something I couldn't quite make out. Then darkness. I woke up the next morning in a freezing, empty car park. My head throbbed, my body aching as I sat up on the cold concrete. I was still wearing the same clothes from the night before, but my coat was gone, and my phone was dead. Panic set in as I tried to piece together what had happened. The last thing I could remember was James's apartment. Somehow I managed to get home. My front door was locked, but something felt wrong. Inside, the house was eerily quiet, and when I checked my bedroom, I found my drawers slightly open, as if someone had rifled through them. My stomach twisted. I called the police. The investigation moved quickly at first. The officers asked me about James, about where he lived and what I remembered. When I described his apartment, they exchanged a glance. "There's no apartment there," one of them said. "That building's been abandoned for months." My blood ran cold. A few hours later, they found James. His body was discovered in a frozen lake just outside of town. The news was almost too much to process. The officers said it looked like suicide. They believed he panicked after drugging me, perhaps realizing I might report him. His car was parked nearby, but there were no other clues. Weeks have passed since that night, but I can't stop replaying it in my head. The police think the case is closed, but I'm not so sure. Sometimes, I wake up in the middle of the night, certain I hear faint footsteps outside my window or the soft scrape of something against my door. The locks have all been changed, but it doesn't make me feel safer. I keep wondering why he left me in that car park instead of doing something worse. Why go through my house? Why leave me alive? I don't have answers, just this gnawing unease that I can't shake. And every time I think about him, I remember his hands on mine at the skating rink, pulling me into the middle of the ice, and the way he smiled like he already knew how the night would end. Winter storms in Alaska aren't unusual. Most of us here know how to handle heavy snow, even when it comes down in thick, blinding sheets. I've been living alone in this modest cabin for about 5 years now. It's nestled at the edge of the woods, far enough from town to enjoy the quiet, but close enough that the drive doesn't feel like an expedition. That night, though, something felt different. It was late December 2017, a Friday. I'd closed up my store early, told my staff to get home before the roads became impassable. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the snow was already piling up, swallowing the outlines of my property. I shoveled just enough to park, went inside, locked up, and turned on the heater. The wind howled, rattling the old window panes, but the sound was oddly comforting. I made cocoa, settled into my recliner, the kind that leans too far back if you're not careful, and put on a documentary about glaciers. It was shaping up to be one of those quiet, cozy nights I'd grown to cherish. But then, around midnight, there was a knock. I froze mid-sip, staring at the front door. Visitors out here, especially at this hour and during a storm, weren't common. I set my mug down and went to the window, pulling the curtain aside just a fraction. The snow outside blurred everything under the dim porch light, but something caught my eye. Boot prints. Fresh ones. They led up to my door, and back down the steps. Whoever it was had knocked, then left. I stood there for a moment, hand hovering over the deadbolt. There was no way I was opening that door. The prints were sharp, edged. No snow had filled them in yet. They were fresh. I stayed there until my breath fogged up the glass, then locked the door again and forced myself back to my recliner. An hour later, the second knock came. This time, it was from the side of the house, right near the kitchen window. My stomach knotted as I grabbed the flashlight I kept near the door. The kitchen window was frosted over, obscuring my view, but I could tell. The snow beneath it was untouched. No tracks. No sign of anyone. But the knock had been real. I flicked off the kitchen light, scanning the yard with my flashlight beam. Snowflakes danced in the light, swirling violently in the wind, but there was nothing else. After a while, I convinced myself it had been a branch, or maybe even just the storm playing tricks. But deep down, I knew better. I triple-checked every window and lock before heading to bed. Flashlight still clutched in my hand. The third knock woke me just before 3 a.m. This one was loud and sharp, coming from the sliding glass door that led to my deck. I sat up, my ears straining over the wind's howl. Slowly, I crept down the hallway, flashlight cutting through the darkness. The sliding door was locked. I'd made sure of it earlier, but the curtain was open. Beyond the glass, the deck was covered in pristine snow. No tracks, no footprints. But the knocks had been real. For the rest of the night, they didn't stop. Every hour, a knock would come from the front door, the back deck, the side window. It was as if someone was circling my house, methodically tapping at each entrance. At one point, I thought I heard faint footsteps crunching in the snow, but when I looked, there was nothing. Just the storm. There was no way I was stepping outside, not in that blizzard, and certainly not when something was out there. I spent the rest of the night in the living room, every light on, the flashlight shaking slightly in my hand. When dawn finally came, the storm had eased, leaving a pale, overcast sky. The silence outside felt deafening. I bundled up in my thickest coat and stepped outside, my boots sinking deep into the snow. At first, everything looked normal, but as I walked around the cabin, I began to notice them. Footprints. They circled my house, weaving between windows and doors, stopping at every entrance. Whoever had made them had walked the perimeter several times, but what unsettled me most was where the tracks led. At the edge of my property, they merged with something else. Tire tracks. A snowmobile. The faint imprint of its tread curved away into the woods. I crouched down, brushing away a thin layer of snow. The tracks weren't fresh. Snowfall had started to bury them, meaning whoever had been out there had left just before dawn. They had planned this. I stared at the tracks disappearing into the tree line, debating whether to follow them. But the snowmobile's trail was already fading, and I wasn't about to trek into the frozen woods alone. When I got back to the house, I called the police. 2 officers arrived, one young, one older. The younger guy looked skeptical, but when I mentioned the snowmobile tracks, his expression changed. The older officer didn't even hesitate. "Not a lot of kids riding snowmobiles during a blizzard at night," he said. They followed the tracks briefly but returned after 15 minutes. The snow had all but erased them. "Whoever it was," the older officer said, "they knew what they were doing. This wasn't random." "What do you think they wanted?" I asked. He hesitated. "Could have been someone looking for shelter, or maybe they just wanted to scare you." But the way he said it, I could tell he didn't believe that either. After they left, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints circling my home, the snowmobile waiting just beyond the trees. Whoever it was, they had been deliberate. They had known exactly what they were doing. By mid-afternoon, I made a decision. I drove into town, straight to the nearest gun store. I'd never owned a firearm before, but that day, I left with a 9mm handgun, a hunting rifle, and enough ammunition to feel prepared. The clerk's parting words echoed in my head on the drive home. Don't go looking for trouble, but make sure you're ready if it finds you. That night, I slept with the handgun on my nightstand and the rifle propped by the front door. I wasn't going to let fear turn my home into a prison. I still love the stillness of winter storms, the way they blanket the world in quiet. But now, I see them differently. They're not just peaceful, they're a veil, a cover for someone lurking just beyond the edge of the tree line. And if they ever come back, I'll be ready this time. It was Christmas Eve, and I was where I always ended up during the holidays, alone. I'd rented a cabin deep in the mountains, hoping for peace and quiet. No family, no friends, no cheerful carols or awkward gatherings. Just the woods, the snow, and the kind of silence that lets you forget the world exists. The cabin was perfect. Small, cozy, surrounded by dense pine forest. The only sound was the crunch of snow under my boots when I arrived, and the occasional gust of wind rattling the shutters. The place had no Wi-Fi, no cell service, not even a TV. Just a wood-burning stove, a creaky bed, and a single window looking out over the clearing. I unpacked my things, got a fire going, and settled into the quiet. For the first few hours, it was everything I wanted. I made a cup of coffee, sat by the stove, and stared out at the snow piling up outside. The forest was beautiful in its stillness, the kind of deep quiet you can only find far from people. It wasn't until I stepped outside to grab more firewood that I first noticed something odd. The clearing around the cabin wasn't big, maybe 50 feet across before the trees started, but it gave me just enough of a view to see the faint outlines of the forest beyond. As I bent to pick up the logs, I saw something standing between the trees. It was tall, too tall to be a deer, and completely still. I froze, clutching the firewood, and squinted into the shadows. The light was fading fast, but I could just make out the shape standing between two pines. It didn't move. "Hello?" I called, my voice sharper than I intended. No response. The woods swallowed my words, leaving only the faint hiss of wind through the trees. I stepped closer to the cabin, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure still didn't move. It was just standing there, watching. I told myself it was nothing, a shadow, a trick of the light, but my gut said otherwise. I backed into the cabin, bolted the door, and locked the shutters on the window. My heart was racing, but I told myself to get a grip. It was nothing, just nerves. I poured a drink, sat by the fire, and tried to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It was around midnight when I heard it, a faint crunching sound coming from outside. I sat up, the blanket falling from my shoulders. At first I thought it might be an animal, but the sound was too deliberate. Heavy, steady steps. Something or someone was walking around the cabin. I grabbed the fire poker and crept to the window. The shutters were still closed, but I peeked through the narrow gap between them, holding my breath. The clearing was empty, but the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the cabin, slow and steady, crunching softly in the snow. My throat tightened. I wanted to call out, but something told me not to. Instead, I stayed frozen by the window, listening. After a few minutes, the footsteps stopped. I waited, my heart pounding, but the silence stretched on. Just as I started to relax, a new sound cut through the quiet. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window. I backed away, clutching the fire poker. The tapping was soft but insistent, like someone drumming their fingers against the glass. "Who's there?" I shouted. No answer. The tapping stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tense, but there was only silence. After a long moment, I forced myself to look through the gap in the shutters again. The clearing was still empty. I didn't sleep. I sat by the stove, staring at the door, the poker still in my hand. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. When the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the shutters, I finally mustered the courage to step outside. The snow had stopped, and the forest was bathed in pale morning light. The clearing was still untouched except for the tracks. Footprints circled the cabin, over and over, close to the walls. They weren't animal tracks. They were long, narrow, and deep, like someone had walked barefoot through the snow. They led to the window, where they stopped. I followed them around the cabin, my breath clouding in the cold air. The tracks stayed close to the walls, circling again and again, as if whatever had made them was pacing. Then they disappeared. They didn't lead to the forest. They didn't trail off into the distance. They just stopped. The snow beyond the clearing was untouched, pristine. I stood there, staring at the tracks, my skin crawling. I don't know what was out there that night. All I know is that I won't be coming back. Before the next story, if you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any of these terrifying stories. It was a bitterly cold winter night, the kind where the chill seeps into your bones no matter how many layers you wear. I was driving back from a late shift at the hospital, the roads almost deserted, blanketed in a fresh layer of snow that glistened under the dim streetlights. My car's heater was working overtime, but I still felt the cold creeping in, a relentless reminder of the harshness outside. I'd taken this route 100 times, a winding back road that cut through a dense forest, its tall pines looming over the narrow path like silent sentinels. Tonight, however, the usual tranquility felt oppressive. The darkness seemed thicker, the shadows deeper, as if the forest itself was closing in around me. My headlights pierced through the blackness, illuminating only the immediate stretch of road ahead. As I navigated a particularly sharp bend, my headlights caught a glint of something on the side of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer, common enough in these parts, but as I got closer, I realized it was a car. It was an old, battered sedan, half buried in the snowbank, its front end crumpled against a tree. I slowed down, my heart rate quickening. There were no other cars around, no sign of anyone else. I pulled over, the crunch of my tires on the snow loud in the stillness. I grabbed my phone and flashlight, stepping out into the freezing air. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it a sense of unease. I approached the car cautiously, shining my light inside. The driver's seat was empty, but the airbags had deployed, and there was a dark stain on the fabric that made my stomach churn. I circled around to the passenger side, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" There was no answer, just the eerie silence of the forest. I felt a pang of dread. Whoever had been driving was nowhere to be seen, and in this cold, that was a bad sign. I debated calling for help, but decided to check the surrounding area first. Maybe they had wandered off, dazed and injured. My breath puffed out in white clouds as I ventured further from the road, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I'd gone maybe 50 yards when I saw it footprints in the snow. They were uneven, like whoever made them was struggling. I followed the tracks, my heart pounding in my chest. The forest was deathly quiet, the only sound the crunch of snow under my boots. The footprints led me deeper into the woods, and I felt a growing sense of urgency. If they were hurt, they wouldn't last long in these conditions. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a faint rustling ahead of me. I quickened my pace, calling out again, "Hello? Are you there?" The rustling stopped, replaced by a low, pained moan. I broke into a run, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly. As I rounded a cluster of trees, I saw them. A figure huddled against a fallen log, their clothes torn and bloodied. I knelt beside them, a man, his face pale and lips blue from the cold. His eyes fluttered open, filled with a mix of fear and relief. "Help, me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 and relaying our location as best as I could. The dispatcher assured me help was on the way, but out here it would take time. I did what I could to keep him warm, wrapping him in my coat and talking to him to keep him conscious. His name was Tom, and he'd swerved to avoid a deer, crashing into the tree. He'd tried to walk for help, but collapsed from the cold and his injuries. I stayed with him, the minutes dragging on, my own fear mounting. The darkness seemed to press in around us, the cold gnawing at my extremities. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I saw the flash of red and blue lights through the trees. The paramedics arrived, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to my frantic worry. They bundled Tom onto a stretcher, reassuring me he would be all right. As they loaded him into the ambulance, one of the paramedics turned to me. "You did good," she said, her breath misting in the cold air. "You probably saved his life." I watched as the ambulance drove away, the red taillights disappearing into the night. I was left standing there, alone in the silent forest, the adrenaline slowly fading. The reality of what had just happened hit me like a wave, and I shivered, not just from the cold, but from the realization of how close it had been. I made my way back to my car, my mind replaying the night's events. As I drove home, the snow-covered road stretching endlessly before me, I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching, a silent witness to the night's harrowing events. I vowed to take the main road from now on, leaving this desolate path to its dark, wintry solitude. Driving along the Oregon coast in late November is usually breathtaking. The endless stretch of ocean to one side, dense evergreen forests pressing in on the other, and mist hanging low like some kind of veil. That's why I was out there, camera bag riding shotgun and a thermos of coffee tucked into the cup holder. Photography had always been my escape, and a storm was rolling in over the Pacific. The moody skies and churning waves would make for some incredible shots. The forecast had warned of heavy rain and strong winds, but I'd been through worse. I followed a winding 2-lane road that hugged the cliffs, occasionally stopping at overlooks to set up my tripod. Late in the afternoon, as the clouds thickened and the light began to fade, I noticed a narrow gravel road branching off towards what looked like an old, abandoned viewpoint. It wasn't on my map, but the angle overlooking the ocean looked promising. I turned onto the path, tires crunching over wet gravel. The road snaked downward into a secluded clearing with an old picnic table and a crumbling stone barrier overlooking the sea. I parked and stepped out into the salt-tinged air. The wind was picking up, and fat raindrops were already starting to fall. I managed to capture a few shots, dark waves crashing violently against the jagged rocks below, before the rain became too heavy to keep my lens dry. Back in the car, I realized my mistake. The gravel path had turned muddy under the relentless rain, and as I tried to back up, my wheels spun uselessly. I was stuck. "All right," I muttered, gripping the wheel. "Stay calm." My phone had no signal, not surprising out here. I had supplies, a full tank of gas, snacks, a blanket, and a rain poncho. Worst case, I'd wait out the storm. An hour later, just as darkness was swallowing the coastline, I noticed headlights approaching from the main road. Relief washed over me as a large, weather-beaten pickup truck rolled into the clearing. It came to a stop a few feet away, and a man climbed out. He was wearing a heavy raincoat, hood pulled low over his face. "You stuck?" he called over the roar of the wind. I cracked my window just an inch. "Yeah, wheels are spinning in the mud. Do you have a tow rope?" He stepped closer, hands shoved deep into his pockets. "Tow rope won't do much good on this slick ground. You'd be better off coming with me back to town. I can drop you at a motel." There was something in his voice, steady, flat, and just a little too casual, that made me hesitate. His posture, the way he was half turned towards his truck as if blocking my view, didn't feel right either. "I think I'll stay here for now," I said, trying to sound polite but firm. "I've got supplies. I'll wait it out." The man didn't move. Rainwater dripped from the edge of his hood, his face obscured by shadows. "Storm's getting worse," he said softly. "You sure you want to be out here all night?" I forced a smile. "I'll be fine, really. Thanks for stopping, though." There was a long silence before he gave a single nod and turned back toward his truck. But he didn't leave. Instead of driving off, he walked slowly around the front of my car, his hand trailing lightly across the hood. It wasn't a casual glance or a mechanic's inspection. It felt deliberate, like he was marking something. I locked my doors and watched him through the side mirror. When he finally got back into his truck, I let out a shaky breath. But the relief was short-lived. The truck didn't leave. Its headlights stayed on, illuminating my rearview mirror with blinding white light. The engine idled, and every so often I'd hear it rev slightly, as if he was testing the gas pedal. I turned off my interior lights and sank low in my seat, clutching my phone even though it was useless without service. I debated running, but where would I go? The rain was torrential, and I had no idea how far I'd have to walk to find help. The truck stayed there for what felt like hours. My eyes burned from staring at the mirror, from the strain of waiting, of trying to figure out what his next move would be. Then, just as suddenly as he'd appeared, the truck's engine roared, and it backed out of the clearing. The red glow of taillights faded into the dark storm, but I wasn't relieved, not yet. I stayed in my car until the first light of dawn broke through the thinning clouds. The rain had stopped, leaving the clearing a swampy mess. I climbed out and inspected the area around my car. That's when I saw them, footprints. Clear, deep impressions in the mud circled my car. He had walked around it multiple times, stopping at each window, each door. I swallowed hard and scanned the woods, half expecting to see him still standing there, watching me. I didn't waste any more time. I managed to wedge rocks and sticks under my tires for traction and freed my car from the mud. I didn't stop until I reached a diner back on the main highway. The waitress noticed how shaken I looked and asked what had happened. I told her everything. The truck, the man, the way he had circled my car and stayed there all night. Her face went pale. "You're lucky," she said softly. "There have been stories about a truck like that. Drivers stranded on back roads, approached by a man offering rides. But the people who accept, they don't always come back." I gripped my coffee cup, my hands trembling. I haven't stopped exploring remote places, and I still chase storms for the perfect shot. But now, I travel with a satellite phone, emergency flares, and extra precautions. Because out there, on lonely back roads and under heavy storm clouds, the most dangerous thing isn't the weather. It's the people who know how to hide within it. It was early December, and the first real snowstorm of the season had rolled in. I had the day off and spent it huddled in my little cabin in the woods, the fire crackling and the wind howling against the windows. I kept the TV on low, cycling through news updates that warned of heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures worsening overnight. By dusk, the world outside was completely white, and the sharp whistle of the wind sent an occasional shiver down my spine. Around 7 p.m., I pulled a heavy quilt over my shoulders and settled onto the couch with a mug of tea. The storm outside had escalated to a full-on blizzard, and visibility was almost non-existent. I remember glancing toward the sliding glass doors that led to my back porch. Through the distorted swirls of snow, I noticed something, or someone, moving at the edge of my property. It was a figure walking slowly but deliberately through the snow. The woods backed right up to my yard, and no one had any business being out there in weather like this. The figure disappeared into the thick curtain of snow, and despite the fire and blanket, I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. About 10 minutes later, there was a knock at my front door. It wasn't loud, just 3 soft raps, as if whoever was on the other side didn't want to draw too much attention. I hesitated for a long moment before cautiously walking over and peeking through the peephole. There stood a man, bundled in a heavy brown coat with a scarf wrapped around most of his face. Snow clung to his shoulders, and his skin was pale, almost bluish. When he saw me looking, he gave a faint smile and raised a trembling hand in a weak wave. "Please," he said, his voice muffled by the scarf. "I've been walking for hours. My car broke down about a mile back. I just need somewhere to warm up for a few minutes." There's an instinct, buried deep in most of us, that whispers when something feels off. It was screaming at me then. "I can't let you in," I said, my voice cracking slightly. "But I can bring you a blanket or some hot tea if you'd like to wait on the porch." The man's smile faltered. He nodded slowly, stepping to the side to sit down on the porch swing. I shut the door, locked it, and hurried to the closet to grab an old blanket. As I returned to the door, blanket in hand, something made me stop. I don't know if it was a sound or just a deep, unshakable feeling, but I paused just before unlocking the deadbolt and leaned to look through the peephole again. The man wasn't sitting anymore. He was standing right at the door, so close that his breath fogged up the glass. One of his hands was on the doorknob, fingers twitching slightly as if testing to see if it would turn. I took several steps back, clutching my phone in one hand as I dialed 911 with trembling fingers. The operator answered, and I explained in a whisper what was happening. As I spoke, I kept my eyes locked on the door. But when I glanced through the peephole again, he was gone. The porch was empty, and the snow on the steps was undisturbed, almost as if no one had ever been there at all. The police arrived about 20 minutes later. They checked around the cabin and the surrounding woods, but didn't find any footprints, tire tracks, or any other evidence of someone having been there. One of the officers tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a drifter trying his luck and leaving when he realized help wasn't coming. But I can't shake the feeling that the man hadn't been planning to leave at all. That night, I double-checked every lock in the house and kept the fire burning until dawn. I never saw the man again, but every winter when the first snowstorm rolls in, I find myself glancing at the porch, half expecting to see him standing there, hand on the doorknob, waiting. When you spend most of your days surrounded by the sound of heavy machinery and the constant buzz of conversation on construction sites, you start to crave silence. Don't get me wrong, I love my job, building homes from the ground up with my crew. But every once in a while, I need to step away from the noise, both literal and figurative. That's why, a few winters ago, I booked a remote lodge out in the Sierra Nevada mountains, a place far from city lights, where snow blankets the world and silence becomes something you can almost touch. A storm was in the forecast, but honestly, that made it all the more appealing. A warm lodge, a roaring fireplace, and snow piling up outside? Perfect. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sky was already bruised with heavy clouds, and snowflakes had started their lazy descent. The driveway leading to the lodge was buried under inches of untouched snow, so I had to park down by the main road and haul my bags uphill. The lodge itself was stunning, rustic yet well kept, perched on a small ridge overlooking a valley. A key was left in a lockbox by the door. Stepping inside, though, I noticed something odd. It was colder than I expected. The heating system was running, but faintly, like it had been left on a low setting for days. I shrugged it off, dropped my bags, and went to start a fire in the old stone fireplace. That's when I noticed the second odd thing: dirty dishes piled in the sink. A couple of mugs, a plate, and a greasy frying pan. Maybe the cleaning crew was in a rush, I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease creeping in. After washing them quickly, I moved on. But the weirdness didn't stop. When I went to unpack in the bedroom, I noticed the bed looked lived in. The sheets were rumpled, the pillow slightly indented. I pressed my hand against the mattress. It was warm. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the heating vents were positioned just right. Maybe it was just residual warmth. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there recently. Still, I pushed those thoughts aside, cooked myself dinner, poured a generous glass of whiskey, and settled by the fire with an old paperback. Outside, the storm began to rage. Snow lashed against the windows, and the wind howled through the pines. It was around midnight when I heard it, a faint creak. At first I brushed it off. It's an old lodge, after all. Wood expands, things shift, houses settle. But then there was another sound, softer this time, almost like a footstep. I grabbed the flashlight from my bag and walked through the darkened rooms. The doors were locked, the windows sealed. Outside, the snow was smooth and unbroken. No footprints. I convinced myself it was the wind or a tree branch scraping against the siding. Eventually, I went back to bed, though sleep came in short, uneasy bursts. The next morning, the storm had passed. Sunlight filtered weakly through the clouds, casting a pale glow over the snow-covered valley. I stepped out onto the porch with a mug of coffee, letting the cold air clear the fog in my head. That's when I saw them. Footprints. They started at the back door, sharp and distinct in the fresh snow. They led away from the lodge and into the forest beyond. My stomach twisted. I set my mug down and followed the prints around the side of the building. They weren't random. They moved deliberately, circling the structure, stopping at windows, at doors. And then it hit me. Whoever had made those tracks hadn't approached during the night. They had left. The noises I'd heard, the dirty dishes, the warm bed, they hadn't been leftovers from a sloppy cleaning crew. Someone had been hiding in the lodge when I arrived. They'd waited until I was asleep to slip out into the storm. I stood there for a long time, staring at those tracks disappearing into the woods. My mind raced with questions I didn't want answers to. I called the property manager immediately. Their apology was almost frantic, stammered out between excuses and reassurances. No one should have been there, they said. The place was supposed to be empty for weeks. Then the woman on the phone added something else, hesitating first. The doors. They all have heavy manual locks on the inside. They can't be opened from the outside, not without a key. Just lock them all before you go to bed tonight, okay? It wasn't comforting, not in the slightest. Still, I spent the rest of the afternoon securing every window, every door. The lodge was old, but those locks were sturdy, industrial grade, the kind you'd expect in a bank vault rather than a vacation rental. That night, the wind picked up again. Snowflakes tapped against the glass like tiny fingertips, and the fire crackled softly in the hearth. I sat by the window, a hunting knife on the table beside me, and my flashlight within arm's reach. I barely slept. Every creak, every gust of wind had me snapping my head up, eyes locked on the shadows shifting across the floor. By sunrise, I'd had enough. I packed my bags, double-checked the locks, and left without calling the property manager again. As I drove down the winding mountain road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the tree line, watching me leave. That weekend changed something in me. Now, whenever I rent a cabin, a lodge, or any remote getaway, I inspect every corner, every closet, every attic hatch. I double-check every lock, every window latch. Because the truth is, in these isolated places where you expect peace and solitude, You're never really as alone as you think you are. And sometimes, the scariest part isn't knowing someone could be out there, it's realizing they already were. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me in the house. Chris had left that morning for a business trip, 2 nights away, and I'd already made plans to indulge in takeout, bad movies, and some much-needed alone time. I was never the paranoid type. Our neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where kids still rode their bikes and neighbors waved at you from their lawns. So when I locked the front door after Chris pulled out of the driveway, I didn't think twice. The first day was normal. I worked from home, answered emails, and when the sun dipped behind the trees, I heated up leftovers for dinner. By 10 p.m., I was curled up on the couch, a terrible horror movie playing, one of those where you yell at the characters for being stupid. I almost laughed when the girl on screen heard a noise outside her window. Classic, I thought. But then I heard it too. A tap. Faint, like someone brushing against the glass. I froze, my eyes snapping to the living room window. The curtains were drawn, the heavy fabric making it impossible to see out or in. My heart thudded as I turned down the TV volume and listened. Nothing. Just the wind whistling outside. Probably a branch, I mumbled to myself, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. But I grabbed my phone and checked the front door camera just to be sure. The screen showed the porch, empty except for the faint glow of the street lamp. I exhaled, laughing softly at myself, and went to bed soon after. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise, a soft, rhythmic thud-thud-thud. I sat up, every nerve in my body on high alert. It was coming from downstairs. My first thought was the old pipes. This house had quirks, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too deliberate, too human. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, holding it tightly as I crept out of bed. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I tiptoed to the top of the stairs. I listened. Silence. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring into the darkness below. Then I shook my head, whispering, "Stop it. You're being ridiculous." I turned back toward the bedroom, but before I could take a step, thud, louder this time. I turned so quickly I almost lost my balance. My thumb hovered over my phone screen, ready to call someone. But who? The cops? To tell them I heard a noise in my perfectly safe house? Still, I checked the front door camera again. This time my stomach dropped. The screen showed the porch light, same as before. But something was off, faint smudges on the glass of the camera lens, as if someone had run their fingers across it. I locked the bedroom door. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me in the house. Chris had left that morning for a business trip, 2 nights away, and I'd already made plans to indulge in takeout, bad movies, and some much-needed alone time. I was never the paranoid type. Our neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where kids still rode their bikes and neighbors waved at you from their lawns. So when I locked the front door after Chris pulled out of the driveway, I didn't think twice. The first day was normal. I worked from home, answered emails, and when the sun dipped behind the trees, I heated up leftovers for dinner. By 10 p.m., I was curled up on the couch, a terrible horror movie playing, one of those where you yell at the characters for being stupid. I almost laughed when the girl on screen heard a noise outside her window. Classic, I thought. But then I heard it too. A tap. Faint, like someone brushing against the glass. I froze, my eyes snapping to the living room window. The curtains were drawn, the heavy fabric making it impossible to see out or in. My heart thudded as I turned down the TV volume and listened. Nothing. Just the wind whistling outside. Probably a branch, I mumbled to myself, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. But I grabbed my phone and checked the front door camera just to be sure. The screen showed the porch, empty except for the faint glow of the street lamp. I exhaled, laughing softly at myself, and went to bed soon after. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise, a soft, rhythmic thud-thud-thud. I sat up, every nerve in my body on high alert. It was coming from downstairs. My first thought was the old pipes. This house had quirks, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too deliberate, too human. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, holding it tightly as I crept out of bed. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I tiptoed to the top of the stairs. I listened. Silence. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring into the darkness below. Then I shook my head, whispering, "Stop it. You're being ridiculous." I turned back toward the bedroom, but before I could take a step, thud, louder this time. I turned so quickly I almost lost my balance. My thumb hovered over my phone screen, ready to call someone. But who? The cops? To tell them I heard a noise in my perfectly safe house? Still, I checked the front door camera again. This time my stomach dropped. The screen showed the porch light, same as before. But something was off, faint smudges on the glass of the camera lens, as if someone had run their fingers across it. I locked the bedroom door. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. I told myself it was a trick of the wind, maybe snowflakes brushing against the camera lens. I hadn't slept much, and I'd seen one too many horror movies the night before. That had to be it. I spent the morning cleaning, music playing loud enough to drown out my thoughts. By early afternoon, I almost felt normal again. The sun was out, and I decided fresh air would help. I bundled up, grabbed my car keys, and opened the front door. And there, in the snow just beyond the porch, were footprints. My throat went dry. They were large, heavy prints that started at the sidewalk and led directly to the porch, then stopped. No sign of them turning back. Just a perfect trail leading up to my house. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and checked the camera again. The lens was clean now, clear, like someone had wiped it off. That night, I couldn't relax. Every shadow felt darker, every sound sharper. I kept the curtains drawn and triple-checked the locks. I told myself Chris would be home soon. At midnight, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the doorbell camera. Motion detected. My blood went cold. I opened the app and the live feed appeared. The porch was empty, but the camera was shaking just slightly, as if someone were touching it, holding it. I muted the phone before the sound of my breathing could give me away. My heart hammered in my chest as I sat there, frozen, watching the feed. After a few seconds, the shaking stopped, and then, for just a moment, something moved at the bottom of the screen. Not a face, not a hand, just the faintest edge of a shadow before it disappeared. I stayed up until dawn, my back pressed against the locked bedroom door, the rifle Chris kept under the bed beside me. I didn't sleep. I didn't blink. I just listened, but I never heard another sound. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend, just me in the house. Chris had left that morning for a business trip, 2 nights away, and I'd already made plans to indulge in takeout, bad movies, and some much-needed alone time. I was never the paranoid type. Our neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where kids still rode their bikes and neighbors waved at you from their lawns. So when I locked the front door after Chris pulled out of the driveway, I didn't think twice. The first day was normal. I worked from home, answered emails, and when the sun dipped behind the trees, I heated up leftovers for dinner. By 10 p.m., I was curled up on the couch, a terrible horror movie playing, one of those where you yell at the characters for being stupid. I almost laughed when the girl on screen heard a noise outside her window. Classic, I thought. But then I heard it too. A tap. Faint, like someone brushing against the glass. I froze, my eyes snapping to the living room window. The curtains were drawn, the heavy fabric making it impossible to see out or in. My heart thudded as I turned down the TV volume and listened. Nothing. Just the wind whistling outside. Probably a branch, I mumbled to myself, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. But I grabbed my phone and checked the front door camera just to be sure. The screen showed the porch, empty except for the faint glow of the street lamp. I exhaled, laughing softly at myself, and went to bed soon after. At 3 a.m., I woke up to a noise, a soft, rhythmic thud-thud-thud. I sat up, every nerve in my body on high alert. It was coming from downstairs. My first thought was the old pipes. This house had quirks, but something about the sound didn't sit right. It was too deliberate, too human. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, holding it tightly as I crept out of bed. The wooden floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I tiptoed to the top of the stairs. I listened. Silence. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring into the darkness below. Then I shook my head, whispering, "Stop it. You're being ridiculous." I turned back toward the bedroom, but before I could take a step, thud, louder this time. I turned so quickly I almost lost my balance. My thumb hovered over my phone screen, ready to call someone. But who? The cops? To tell them I heard a noise in my perfectly safe house? Still, I checked the front door camera again. This time my stomach dropped. The screen showed the porch light, same as before. but something was off. Faint smudges on the glass of the camera lens, as if someone had run their fingers across it. I locked the bedroom door. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. I told myself it was a trick of the wind, maybe snowflakes brushing against the camera lens. I hadn't slept much, and I'd seen one too many horror movies the night before. That had to be it. I spent the morning cleaning, music playing loud enough to drown out my thoughts. By early afternoon, I almost felt normal again. The sun was out, and I decided fresh air would help. I bundled up, grabbed my car keys, and opened the front door. And there, in the snow just beyond the porch, were footprints. My throat went dry. They were large, heavy prints that started at the sidewalk and led directly to the porch, then stopped. No sign of them turning back. Just a perfect trail leading up to my house. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and checked the camera again. The lens was clean now, clear, like someone had wiped it off. That night, I couldn't relax. Every shadow felt darker, every sound sharper. I kept the curtains drawn and triple-checked the locks. I told myself Chris would be home soon. At midnight, I was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea when my phone buzzed. It was a notification from the doorbell camera. Motion detected. My blood went cold. I opened the app and the live feed appeared. The porch was empty, but the camera was shaking just slightly, as if someone were touching it, holding it. I muted the phone before the sound of my breathing could give me away. My heart hammered in my chest as I sat there, frozen, watching the feed. After a few seconds, the shaking stopped, and then, for just a moment, something moved at the bottom of the screen. Not a face, not a hand, just the faintest edge of a shadow before it disappeared. I stayed up until dawn, my back pressed against the locked bedroom door, the rifle Chris kept under the bed beside me. I didn't sleep. I didn't blink. I just listened, but I never heard another sound. When Chris came home later that day, he found me in the living room, curled up on the couch, pale and exhausted. He frowned, setting his bags down. "Hey, you okay?" I nodded. "Yeah, just didn't sleep well." He smiled, kissed my forehead, and went to grab his bags. "Hey," he called from the doorway. "Why are there smudges all over the kitchen window?" The winter of 2018 in England was one of the heaviest snowfalls I can remember. At the time, I loved the snow, loved the silence it brought, the way it muffled the world. But after what happened, I can't stand it anymore. My parents had planned a weekend trip to visit family in Devon. I was 16, and I wasn't thrilled about the idea of being stuck in a stuffy house with relatives I didn't particularly like. So, I faked a stomach bug. To my surprise, they believed me and left me in charge of the house. I was old enough after all. Saturday was perfect. I played Fortnite, binged Netflix, and spent an hour outside throwing snowballs for our dog, Luna. She's a scruffy spaniel with boundless energy, and nothing makes her happier than bounding through fresh snow. That evening, around 7 p.m., hunger struck. The fridge was full, but everything required too much effort. So I decided to walk to the local fish and chip shop in the village. It was about a 15-minute walk, down a narrow footpath, locals call it the Cut, lined with skeletal trees and flickering old street lamps. By the time I got my chips and battered sausage, the sky had turned to deep blue and black, and the snow had started falling lightly again. Clutching the warm paper bag, I started back through the Cut. About halfway home, I heard it, a snap from somewhere in the trees to my right. I froze, heart hammering, and turned my head slowly. The orange glow from one of the street lamps barely lit the woods, casting long shadows across the snow. Nothing. Probably just a fox, I muttered to myself. But then I heard it again. 2 sharp cracks, closer this time. I walked faster, my breath fogging up in the cold air. I reached the final stretch of the Cut, where the last street lamp had been out for months. That section was pitch black. I hesitated for a second before pressing on, gripping the greasy paper bag like it was a lifeline. Then I heard it, a new sound, footsteps, crunching, heavy. I spun around, and my stomach dropped. A silhouette stood under the dim light of the second to last street lamp. It was tall, and it was running straight at me. I bolted. Snow kicked up around my ankles as I sprinted, slipping and sliding, barely staying upright. I burst out of the Cut, Luna barking madly from behind our front window. I fumbled with my keys, my gloved hands clumsy and shaking. The figure was close now, maybe 20 feet away. I jammed the key into the lock, threw myself inside, and slammed the door shut behind me, bolting it tight. I stood there panting, staring through the frosted glass window. Nothing. The street outside was empty. I tried to calm myself. Maybe it was just someone messing around, another local trying to scare me. But that explanation didn't sit right. I spent the next few hours watching Netflix, Luna curled up at my side. I couldn't relax, though. Every creak, every gust of wind outside made my skin crawl. Around midnight, Luna started barking, loud, frantic barks directed at the back door. I felt my stomach tighten. Slowly, I walked to the kitchen. The glass pane on the back door was foggy from the cold, and the garden outside was barely visible in the dim porch light. I flipped the outside light on. Nothing. Fresh snow blanketed the garden, and it looked undisturbed. I sighed, dragged Luna away, and went back to the couch. But something nagged at me. The snow. It wasn't entirely undisturbed. There were tracks leading to the back door, my tracks, from when I'd come home earlier. Wait, I came in through the front door. Ice pooled in my veins. Slowly, I turned and walked back to the kitchen. The cold was more noticeable now. My breath fogged in front of me. The back door was open. Wide open. The layout of our house meant 3 directions from that doorway: the kitchen, the living room, or the stairs leading up to the bedrooms. As I stood frozen, there was a faint sound above me, a light thump. Upstairs, my body moved before my brain could catch up. I grabbed Luna, snatched my phone from the table, and bolted out the front door. I didn't stop running until I was at our neighbor's house. I pounded on their door until the lights flicked on and Mr. Harris opened up, bleary-eyed and grumpy. His expression shifted when he saw my face. After I explained what happened, they let me in and called the police. The officers took nearly 40 minutes to arrive because of the worsening snowstorm. They searched the house top to bottom and found nothing. No one was there. But when they checked our CCTV camera, one my dad had installed above the back door, it showed something. Just minutes after I had left for the chip shop, a figure emerged from the woods behind our house. They walked calmly up to the back door, slipped inside, and disappeared into the shadows of the hallway. About an hour later, just before I returned home, the same figure darted out of the house, vaulting over the back fence and vanishing into the snowy woods. The tracks in the snow had been filled in by fresh snowfall, leaving no trail to follow. For weeks after, I jumped at every creak in the house, every shadow outside my window. We installed new locks, brighter outdoor lights, and motion sensors. But it didn't change the fact that someone had been in my home, watching me, and worst of all, they knew I was there alone. Christmas Eve always made me feel hollow. The lights, the music, the cheer. It all felt like a cruel reminder that I had no one to share it with. No family, no friends, just me and my fading hope that things might change. This year I decided to drive, not to anywhere specific, just away. I thought maybe the open road would make me feel less stuck. It was cold, snow had been falling all afternoon, and the roads were getting slick. But I didn't care. I kept driving. I was somewhere deep in the mountains, the kind of stretch where the nearest gas station might be 40 miles away, when I saw him, a man standing on the shoulder of the road. He was tall and skinny with a ratty coat that hung off his frame like it barely fit. His hands were stuffed into his pockets, and his face was hidden by the brim of a baseball cap. The snow was falling heavier now, and he just stood there, motionless, as my car approached. I slowed down, more out of instinct than anything. What was he doing out here in the middle of nowhere? There were no houses, no cars, nothing. Just the woods and the road. As I pulled up beside him, I rolled down my window a crack. "You okay?" I called out. The man turned his head slowly toward me, but he didn't answer. "You need a ride?" I tried again. For a long moment, he just stared. Then, without a word, he nodded and walked toward the passenger door. Something about him made me uneasy, but I told myself it was just the situation. It's not every day you see someone out in the middle of nowhere like that. Still, when he climbed into the car, I couldn't shake the sense that I'd made a mistake. He didn't smell like booze or drugs, just wet wool and cigarettes. His face was gaunt, his cheeks hollow, and there was something off about his eyes. They were sharp, almost predatory, but completely empty at the same time. "Thanks," he muttered, barely loud enough to hear. His voice was gravelly, like he hadn't used it in a while. "No problem," I said, gripping the wheel tighter than I needed to. "Where you headed?" "Just up the road." That wasn't much of an answer, but I didn't press him. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost oppressive. The only sounds were the hum of the heater and the crunch of my tires on the snow-covered road. After a few miles, he finally spoke again. "You got any family?" The question caught me off guard. No," I said. "Not anymore." He nodded like he already knew the answer. "Must be nice," he said quietly. I didn't know what to say to that, so I stayed silent. The tension in the car kept building. Every so often, I'd glance at him out of the corner of my eye. He was sitting stiffly, staring straight ahead, his hands still buried in his coat pockets. Then I noticed something that made my stomach drop. His feet. They were bare. No boots, no shoes, just pale, bony feet dusted with melting snow. "You okay, man?" I asked, trying to sound calm. He didn't answer. I tried again. "You sure you don't need me to take you to a hospital or something? It's freezing out there." Still nothing. I kept driving, my pulse thundering in my ears. My gut told me to get this guy out of my car, but the snow was coming down harder now, and I couldn't just kick him out in the middle of a storm. That's when I noticed him moving. At first, it was subtle, a shift of his weight, a twitch of his fingers. Then slowly, he pulled his right hand out of his pocket. I caught a glimpse of something shiny. "Pull over," he said, his voice low and calm. "What?" I stammered. "Pull over," he repeated, more firmly this time. My mind raced. My first thought was to floor it, but with the snow piling up, there was no way I could outrun him if I slid off the road. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't have any money. You can check my wallet if you want. Just..." "Stop the car," he snapped, cutting me off. I slowed down, but not because I wanted to. The road ahead curved sharply, and I didn't trust myself to navigate it at speed. As the car crawled to a stop, I felt my heartbeat in my throat. "Turn it off," he said. I hesitated, but when he raised the knife just slightly, I did as he asked. The engine died, and for a moment, the world was eerily quiet. "Get out," he said. "What?" "Out, now." My hands trembled as I unbuckled my seatbelt and pushed the door open. The cold hit me like a slap to the face, but I barely noticed. "Walk," he said, gesturing toward the woods with the knife. I stepped into the snow, my mind racing for a way out of this. The road was deserted, and even if someone came by, they'd never see me through the trees. "Move," he barked. I stumbled toward the tree line, the snow crunching beneath my boots. My breath came in short, panicked gasps, fogging the air in front of me. Then out of nowhere, I heard it, the faint rumble of an engine. A pair of headlights cut through the snow, and my would-be attacker froze. "Help!" I screamed, waving my arms frantically. The car screeched to a stop, and the driver, a burly guy in a plaid jacket, jumped out. "What the hell's going on here?" he yelled. The man with the knife hesitated for a split second before bolting into the woods. I told the driver everything, barely able to get the words out through my shivering. He called the police, and we waited together until they arrived. They searched the woods but didn't find him. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Those empty eyes staring back at me. I don't know what his plan was. Maybe to rob me. Maybe worse. But one thing's for sure. I won't ever forget the way he looked, standing there in the snow, barefoot and calm, like he'd done this before. Last winter, I was driving home for the holidays. My family lives about 16 hours away, and I usually push through in one long, exhausting drive. But this year, the snow had come early, and the roads were slow and treacherous. I accepted that I'd probably need to stop somewhere overnight. I didn't book anything in advance since I wasn't sure how far I'd make it. The snow had started lightly when I left, just a delicate dusting on the highway. But as the hours passed, it thickened. Traffic crawled. By 9 p.m., I'd barely covered half the distance. The frustration was mounting. The snowplows were nowhere in sight, and the thought of spending another 7 or 8 hours behind the wheel tomorrow made me want to scream. Around midnight, I couldn't keep my eyes open any longer. I spotted a worn-out road sign for a motel at the next exit and took the turn. The place wasn't much to look at. A single-story strip of faded rooms with flickering neon lights spelling out vacancy. The parking lot was blanketed in snow, tire tracks barely visible. I pulled in and parked near the front office. Inside, the lobby was tiny and outdated, the smell of stale coffee and mildew hanging heavy in the air. A handwritten sign sat on the counter. Back in 15 minutes. There was a little doodle of a steaming coffee cup beside it. I sighed and went back to my car. That's when I noticed something odd. The parking lot was completely empty. Not a single car, no tire tracks showing fresh arrivals. Nothing. I leaned back in my seat, watching the snow whip across my windshield, and tried to convince myself that the manager had just stepped out briefly. Maybe they walked to a nearby gas station. The heater hummed softly as I adjusted my seat and decided to close my eyes, just for a few minutes. When I woke up, the car was cold again. My windshield was half covered in a thick layer of snow, and the storm had intensified. The clock on my dash read 3:27 a.m. As I rubbed my eyes, I froze. Someone was standing just outside my driver's side window, staring straight at me. I jerked upright, and the man flinched back a step. His face was partially obscured by a hood, but I could see enough of it to notice the sharpness in his eyes. He turned his head and shouted something into the snowy darkness. That's when I noticed headlights cutting through the storm from a large pickup truck parked across the lot. Another man stepped out of the driver's side and started walking toward me. The first guy circled around my car, yanking on the door handles one by one. The second man joined him, and they began murmuring to each other before one of them sprinted back to the truck and returned with something. I couldn't tell what it was, but it looked heavy. My heart was hammering as I jammed the car into reverse. The tires spun uselessly against the snow-packed pavement. I tried again, rocking the car back and forth, but I wasn't moving fast enough. The sharp sound of glass shattering filled the air. The back window behind me exploded inward, and icy shards rained over the back seat. One of the men reached through the broken glass, fumbling for the door lock. My breath caught as I slammed my foot down on the gas. The car finally lurched backward, skidding violently to one side. The man reaching through the window lost his balance and tumbled out into the snow. The other guys sprinted back to the truck, but I didn't wait to see if they'd follow. I gripped the wheel, spun my car around, and fishtailed my way out of the parking lot. For a few agonizing seconds, I could see their truck's headlights in my rearview mirror, but they didn't follow me onto the main road. Instead, they disappeared into the swirling snow, swallowed by the storm. I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town, where I parked at a well-lit gas station, shaking so hard I could barely pull my phone out to call the police. They took my report, but I could tell from their tone that they weren't too optimistic about catching anyone. Looking back, I still kick myself for falling asleep in that parking lot. Maybe I should have kept driving or picked a bigger hotel off the main road. But those men, they were prepared. Their timing, their movements. It felt like they had done this before, maybe many times. Whatever they had planned, I'm grateful I never had to find out. I'm 27 now, but this happened when I was 26. My mom passed away a few years back, and my dad, Mark, has been blind since I was a kid. Fortunately, he made some smart financial moves early in life. He sold a successful energy business, which left us comfortable and able to manage multiple rental properties. My sister Amy and I live together in our family home, while Dad lives in a cozy one-story condo about 10 minutes away. It's within walking distance of the village, where he can get groceries and run small errands. Dad is stubbornly independent and manages well on his own, but Amy and I take him to doctor appointments or anywhere too far to walk. This all happened during a brutal winter storm. Amy was staying over at her boyfriend's house about 30 minutes away, so I was home alone. The snow was relentless, thick flakes swirling under the streetlights and roads coated in slush. Something gnawed at me that evening. I decided to call Dad just to check in. He still prefers his landline over his smartphone because, in his words, why fix what isn't broken? But the call rang 4 times before going to voicemail. I tried again, same result. Normally Dad answers immediately or calls back within minutes. I called Amy. She hadn't heard anything about Dad going out. That's when the anxiety started to settle deep in my chest. The storm was no joke, and the thought of Dad walking out in it made my stomach twist. I grabbed my coat and keys and started the drive to his condo. The roads were nearly empty, and my phone kept buzzing with weather advisories. By the time I arrived, the world was blanketed in a heavy, eerie silence. The first thing I noticed were footprints in the snow leading up to the condo's door and away from it. Fresh ones. That should have reassured me, but instead, it made me feel uneasy. As I approached, the neighbor across the hall, an older woman named Mrs. Harris, peeked out her door. "Oh, hello, dear," she said warmly. "My husband just gave your father a ride to the shop about 10 minutes ago. He should be back soon." I smiled and thanked her, feeling slightly better. I figured I'd wait inside. The door was unlocked. Dad always forgets to lock the door, despite Amy and I reminding him 1,000 times. I sighed, stepped inside, and shut the door behind me. The condo was quiet. Too quiet. Something immediately felt off. The faint smell of wet clothes and cold air hung in the air. As I took off my boots, my eyes caught something. Faint, melted footprints leading from the front door, through the living room, and down the hallway toward Dad's bedroom. "Dad?" I called out. No response. The tracks led into his room and stopped at the ensuite bathroom door, which was closed. Dad never closes doors. It makes navigation harder for him. My stomach tightened. I walked slowly down the hall and into his room. His phone was vibrating on the nightstand, lighting up with my missed calls. But the bed was empty, and the bathroom door remained shut. I knocked lightly. "Dad?" Nothing. The shower curtain was drawn shut, which was even stranger. Dad always leaves it open, another habit to make navigating easier. I froze, staring at the curtain. The air in the room felt heavier, like it was pressing against my chest. Something inside me screamed not to touch that curtain. Instead, I backed out of the room, quietly shut the door, and walked straight to the front door. I stepped outside, locked it behind me, and called the police. The storm had slowed response times, but to their credit, 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes. Together, we re-entered the condo. When we reached Dad's bedroom, the sight made my blood run cold. A man was sitting on the edge of the bed, hands raised in surrender. He was soaking wet, his shoes still leaving faint puddles on the carpet. It was like he had been waiting. Dad arrived home minutes later with the neighbor's husband. The confusion and concern on his face broke my heart. The officers questioned the man and found his ID. He lived just a few units down. Apparently, he had been watching Dad's routine for a while, waiting for the right opportunity. Maybe he thought the snowstorm gave him cover. Maybe he thought no one would check in on Dad during such awful weather. Whatever his plan had been, it didn't work out. The scariest part? He had hidden in the bathroom when I first arrived. If I had opened that curtain, my dad, ever the gentle soul, didn't even want to press charges. But Amy and I insisted. The man was eventually charged with third-degree burglary and is still in jail as far as I know. We replaced Dad's locks, installed extra security cameras, and made sure every neighbor in the building knew to keep an eye out for him. But even now, every time I see a heavy snowfall coating the streets in white silence, I feel a prickle of unease, because I know how close I came to pulling back that curtain. With a spacious yard and a stunning view of the mountains. After a long drive with the kids squabbling in the back seat, we arrived just before dusk. The place was just as nice as it looked online, maybe even better. My wife, Emily, smiled as we unpacked, and the kids ran off to explore the yard. It felt like the start of a much-needed break. As we carried bags inside, the neighbor introduced himself. He was standing at the edge of his driveway, just a few steps from our rental. A tall, wiry man with graying hair and an overly enthusiastic smile. "Hi there, I'm Gary," he called out, waving. "I live right next door. You folks just get in?" I nodded, trying to be polite, but already feeling something off. His smile lingered a little too long, and his eyes seemed to dart over the house, the car, and then back to us. "Yeah, just arrived," I said. "Looking forward to some peace and quiet." He chuckled. "Oh, you'll get that here, all right. Not much goes on around here. If you need anything, just let me know. I'm always around." The way he said it made my skin prickle. That first night, we didn't think much of him. Gary seemed harmless, just an overly friendly neighbor. But the next morning, when we took the kids outside to play, he was there again. This time, standing in his yard, arms crossed, staring into ours. He waved when he saw me looking, his face breaking into that same too-wide smile. I waved back reluctantly. Emily frowned. "Is he just going to stand there?" she whispered. "Probably just bored," I muttered, brushing it off. But every time we looked up, he was still there, standing in his yard, watching us. Later, after lunch, we settled into the lounge room. The kids were playing a board game on the floor while Emily and I read on the couch. It was peaceful, until I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. Gary was standing outside the lounge room window. I froze, unsure if I was seeing things, but when I looked again, there he was. His face was partially obscured by the glass, but I could tell he was staring right at us. I stood abruptly, and he didn't flinch, just kept watching, "What's wrong?" Emily asked, following my gaze. When she saw him, her face went pale. I moved to the window and opened it just enough to say, "Can I help you with something?" Gary smiled. "Oh no, just saw you all in there and thought I'd say hi. Nice view from this side of the house, huh?" I didn't respond. He lingered a moment longer before finally walking away. That night, after putting the kids to bed, Emily and I sat out on the balcony with a bottle of wine, trying to shake the unease from earlier. The night was crisp and quiet, the stars bright overhead. But then I saw him again. Gary was on his balcony, directly across from ours, sitting in a chair and watching us. He wasn't trying to hide it either. His chair was angled toward us, and his face was dimly illuminated by a weak porch light. "Let's go inside," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't argue. The next day, the tension only grew. Every time we stepped outside, there he was. If the kids were playing in the yard, he'd find some reason to be in his. When we walked to the car to head into town, he came out of his house and waved. He was always there. By the third night, I was on edge. I double-checked the locks before bed, something I rarely did at home. Emily and I stayed up late, talking about whether we should cut the trip short. We finally decided to sleep on it, hoping things would feel different in the morning. But I woke up to the sound of a floorboard creaking. At first I thought it was one of the kids. I sat up listening, but the house was silent. Then I heard it again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate footsteps. "Emily," I whispered, shaking her awake. "What?" she mumbled groggily. "Someone's in the house." Her eyes widened and she sat up, clutching my arm. We both listened, hearts pounding. The footsteps were moving toward the kitchen. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy lamp, and crept toward the door. Emily followed, clutching her phone. When I peeked around the corner, I saw him. Gary, standing in the middle of the kitchen, illuminated by the faint glow of the microwave clock. "Hey!" I shouted, stepping into the room. Gary's head snapped toward me, and for a split second he looked startled. Then he bolted. He was out the back door before I could stop him. I called the police while Emily locked every door and window. The kids woke up crying, frightened by all the noise. When the police arrived, they searched the house and the surrounding area, but Gary was gone. The officer we spoke to said Gary's house looked like it hadn't been lived in for months. It was mostly empty, aside from a few pieces of old furniture. There was no sign of him anywhere. The next morning, we packed up and left, cutting the trip short. The kids were quiet on the drive home, and Emily kept glancing in the rearview mirror as if expecting to see Gary's face behind us. Even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes late at night I'll catch myself checking the locks, imagining the faint sound of footsteps in the hall. I don't know who Gary really was or what he wanted, but I know one thing for sure. I'll never stay in another Airbnb again. I thought Christmas would be easier this year. No family, no friends, no expectations, just me, a quiet evening, and a cheap bottle of whiskey in my little rental house at the edge of town. I'd told myself I didn't mind being alone. I'd stopped pretending to care about the holidays a long time ago. All the lights, the music, the cheerful families, it just reminded me of what I didn't have. It was around 10 p.m. on Christmas Eve when the knock came. I was sitting on the couch, staring at the tree I'd put up out of some half-hearted attempt to feel festive, when I heard it. Knock, knock. It startled me. My house sits on the outskirts of town, practically in the woods. I don't get visitors, especially not at that hour, in the middle of a snowstorm. For a moment I thought I'd imagined it, but then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. I got up and moved cautiously toward the door, the whiskey warming my veins but not dulling my unease. "Who is it?" I called, my voice steadier than I felt. No answer. I glanced through the peephole. A man stood on my porch, his head down, his shoulders hunched against the wind. He wasn't dressed for the weather, just a thin jacket and no hat, no gloves. Snow clung to his hair and beard. "Can I help you?" I asked, not opening the door. He looked up then, and even through the peephole, I didn't like the way he smiled. Too wide, too forced. "Car broke down," he said. His voice was muffled by the wind. "Been walking a while. Can I come in?" Something about him didn't sit right with me. He wasn't slurring, didn't seem drunk, but there was a strange intensity in his eyes, even through the distorting glass. "I can call someone for you," I offered, my hand tightening on the doorknob. "No service," he said flatly. "Phone's dead. I just need to warm up." I hesitated. It was freezing outside. and the nearest gas station was miles away. If he was telling the truth, I'd be condemning him to freeze, but my gut told me to keep the door shut. "There's a diner about 2 miles back," I said. "They're open all night." His smile faltered. "Come on, man. It's Christmas." Something about the way he said it. The sharpness under the words sent a chill down my spine. "Sorry," I said, my voice firmer now. "I can't help you." For a moment, he just stood there staring at the door. Then he stepped back, his smile returning, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Suit yourself," he said, turning and walking off the porch. I waited, listening to the crunch of his footsteps in the snow. They faded into the distance, and eventually all I could hear was the wind. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. Something about him stuck with me, gnawed at the edges of my mind. I double-checked the locks and drew the curtains, but the sense of unease lingered. Around midnight, I was still awake, sitting in the living room with the lights off. The only illumination came from the Christmas tree, its soft glow casting long shadows across the walls. Then I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. It was softer this time, almost hesitant, but it sent my heart racing all the same. I crept to the door and peeked through the curtain. The porch was empty. My breath fogged the glass as I stared out into the night. The snow had stopped, and the moonlight reflected off the fresh powder, making everything look sharper, clearer. I scanned the yard, the edge of the woods, the road beyond. Nothing. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw them. Footprints in the snow. They led from the road to my porch, but there were no tracks leading away. Panic clawed at my chest. I checked the locks again, grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the kitchen, and sat in the corner of the living room, my back to the wall, where I could see both the door and the window. The house felt too quiet. Every creak of the old wood, every groan of the wind made me flinch. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, clutching the knife, my ears straining for any sound. Just when I thought maybe, just maybe I was safe, the power went out. The Christmas tree went dark, plunging the room into shadow. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The only light now came from the faint glow of the moon through the curtains. And that's when I heard it. Not a knock this time, a scratch. Soft, deliberate, right at the edge of the window. My blood ran cold. Slowly, I turned my head. My eyes locked on the thin sliver of moonlight seeping through the curtain. A shadow passed in front of it. I didn't wait. I bolted for the bedroom, locking the door behind me and shoving the dresser in front of it for good measure. I sat there in the dark, my back against the wall, the knife still in my hand, and waited. The scratching moved around the house from one window to the next, then back to the front door. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. When the sun finally came up, I mustered the courage to leave the bedroom. My hands were shaking as I moved the dresser and unlatched the door. The house was empty, but outside the snow told a different story. Footprints circled the house, over and over, crisscrossing back and forth like whoever made them had been pacing all night. I followed them to the edge of the woods, where they disappeared into the trees. I don't know who or what was out there that night. All I know is, I'm never spending Christmas alone again. Last winter, my friend Colin and I decided to escape the humdrum of our everyday lives in a small town by heading into the Alaskan wilderness for a week. We'd heard about a remote cabin online, advertised as the perfect retreat with breathtaking views and a wood-burning stove to keep us cozy. It was located about 2 hours from my place, tucked deep in the forest, far from civilization. The idea of being surrounded by snow-covered trees and peaceful nights by the fire sounded like a dream. We packed up and set out in the early afternoon, the drive uneventful at first. But as we got closer to the cabin, the road began narrowing and eventually gave way to a narrow trail cutting through the vast, snow-covered forest. By the time we arrived, dusk was beginning to settle, casting long shadows across the snow. The cabin was small but inviting, with just one bedroom, a modest kitchen, and a fireplace that had seen better days. The silence surrounding it was almost eerie, broken only by the occasional sound of the wind rustling through the trees. After we unpacked, we decided to explore the forest before darkness fully set in. The quiet was unsettling, the kind of silence that felt like it was pressing in on you, like the trees were watching. We walked along a winding path, the snow crunching beneath our boots. That's when we heard it. An eerie scream, faint at first but unmistakably human. Colin and I froze, exchanging nervous glances. Then it came again, louder and more desperate. It was the kind of scream that makes your blood run cold, like someone was in grave danger. "We need to check it out," Colin said. He was always the braver one. maybe even reckless. I hesitated, wanting to turn back, but the thought of someone in trouble in that desolate place pushed me forward. We followed the sound, our footsteps quick and uneven as the screams grew louder. Soon we spotted a flickering light in the distance. It came from an old run-down cabin, its windows grimy and roof sagging under the weight of the snow. The light inside flickered, either from a lantern or a fire. As we crept closer, the screaming stopped, replaced by muffled sounds, someone crying or gasping for air. Colin motioned for me to stay back as he approached the window. He wiped away a small patch of frost and peered inside. When he turned to me, his face was as white as the snow. "There's a man tied to a chair," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And another man. He's wearing a mask and holding a knife." A cold wave of dread washed over me. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like jelly. Before I could react, a voice suddenly cut through the air behind us. "What are you doing?" We spun around. A man stood just a few feet away, tall and broad, shouldered, his face obscured by the shadow of his hood. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt them piercing through us, cold and unblinking. Neither of us said anything. Colin grabbed my arm and we bolted. The man shouted something, but I didn't stop to listen. The forest blurred around us as we ran. The crunch of snow underfoot, and the sound of his heavy footsteps chasing us. My lungs burned and my heart pounded in my chest. I dared not look back. We reached the cabin and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. For a moment we stood there, panting, trying to catch our breath. Then we turned off the lights and peered out the window, expecting to see the man coming after us. But the forest was empty. The wind howled through the trees and nothing moved. Colin grabbed his phone and called the authorities. It felt like hours before we saw the flashing red and blue lights slicing through the dark. 2 officers stepped out of their vehicle, their breath fogging in the cold. We hurried outside and told them everything. The screams, the man tied up, the masked figure, and the man who had chased us. The officers didn't seem entirely convinced, but agreed to check out the old cabin. We led them through the forest, our flashlights cutting through the shadows. When we reached the cabin, my stomach dropped. It was empty. No light, no signs of life. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. Inside, there was nothing but an empty room with a dusty floor and a broken chair in the corner. The officers assured us they'd continue searching and told us to stay put for the night. We didn't sleep at all. I couldn't shake the image of the masked man, and I kept wondering if he was out there, waiting, watching us. 2 days later, the authorities called to say they'd caught both men, the masked man and the one who had been tied up. The officer on the phone sounded uneasy, like there was more to the story than he was letting on. When I pressed him for details, he just said, "It's better if you don't know." We left the cabin that same day, cutting our trip short. The forest no longer felt peaceful. It felt like it was hiding something we weren't meant to uncover. Even now, back at home, I can't shake the memory of that night. The screams, the masked man, the chase, it's all etched into my mind. Sometimes when I'm lying awake at night, I can almost hear that voice in the forest again. It was December in Minnesota, and the world outside my window was blanketed with about a foot of snow. The neighborhood was unnervingly quiet, as if the snow had muffled every sound, leaving only a heavy stillness in the air. My parents were out at a bar that night, and my brother was at a friend's house, leaving me with the house to myself. I didn't mind the solitude. In fact, I enjoyed it. I was curled up in the living room, a blanket wrapped around me, watching some show on TV. The soft glow from the screen illuminated the room, while the rest of the house remained in darkness. The only sound was the steady ticking of the clock on the wall, marking the passing of time. I had just finished a bag of chips when I heard it, a faint knocking sound coming from the basement. At first I assumed it was just the old pipes groaning. Our house was old, and it often made strange noises, especially in the winter. But this sound was different, more deliberate, soft but steady. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stood up, wrapping the blanket around my shoulders like a cape, and made my way to the basement door. The floor felt cold under my socks, and the air seemed heavier as I reached for the door handle. I opened the door, flipped the light switch, and peered down the stairs. The light flickered for a moment before holding steady, casting long shadows across the walls. I took the stairs slowly, each step creaking beneath my weight. When I reached the bottom, I looked around. The basement smelled faintly of dust and old cardboard. Everything was in its place. Boxes stacked neatly in the corners, an old desk covered in papers, and a few plastic bins near the far wall. There was nothing out of the ordinary. I walked around, checking the small windows for any signs of movement or a draft that could have caused the noise, but there was nothing, just the stillness. With a shrug, I figured it was probably my imagination playing tricks on me, or maybe the snow shifting against the house. I went back upstairs, closed the basement door, and returned to the couch. 5 minutes later, just as I was starting to relax, I heard it again. A loud crash from the basement, followed by the sound of a door slamming open. My heart raced as I sat up, staring at the basement door. This time, it was a sound I couldn't ignore. It was sharp and clear, like something heavy being knocked over. I hesitated for a moment, the house suddenly feeling too quiet, the shadows in the corners darker than before. My hands were cold and clammy as I walked back to the basement door, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe my brother had come home early, trying to scare me as a joke. "Ryan, is that you?" I called out, my voice shaky. Silence. I called again, louder this time, but the only response was the faint hum of the basement light. I swallowed hard and started down the stairs. The air felt colder now, and the basement light flickered once more as I reached the bottom. What I saw made my stomach drop. The desk drawers were open and papers were scattered across the floor. Boxes that had once been neatly stacked were now tipped over, their contents spilling out. The plastic bins near the wall had been knocked over, their lids lying a few feet away. It looked like someone had been searching for something. But the worst part was the back door. It was wide open. The glass was fogged up from the freezing air pouring in, and snow had blown inside, forming a thin layer on the floor near the doorframe. Leading out into the backyard were footprints. They were deep, clear, and fresh, disappearing into the snowy night. I froze for a moment, my thoughts spinning. Someone had been in my house. Someone had been in my basement while I was just a floor above, oblivious. The thought made my skin crawl. I ran to the door, slammed it shut, and locked it as quickly as I could. My fingers fumbled with my phone as I called my parents. My mom answered, and I tried to explain what had happened, my voice trembling. She told me to stay put. They were on their way home. When they arrived, my dad grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside to follow the footprints. My mom stayed with me, her hand on my shoulder, trying to keep me calm. My dad's boots crunched through the snow as he moved across the yard, following the tracks over the fence and onto the road behind our house. He came back a few minutes later, shaking his head. The footprints stopped at the road. Whoever it was had probably gotten into a car and driven away. The police came soon after. They walked through the basement, taking notes and looking for signs of forced entry, but there were none. The door hadn't been broken. It had been unlocked. My dad swore he had locked it earlier, but maybe it hadn't latched properly. The officers said it might have been a random burglary, someone picking our house because it looked empty, but part of me couldn't shake the feeling that it was something more. The way everything had been searched so carefully made it feel personal, like whoever it was had been looking for something specific.